And I hope all
Yes.
of you with your families, you're safe at home amidst all this corona panic and the scare. I hope all of you are safe and all of you are healthy. Now, as Shweta said, our session today is on HIV prevention, pre-exposure and post-exposure prophylaxis. Just give me a minute so that I can share my screen with all of you.
Yeah, ma'am. Sorry to interrupt. All the questions will be taken at the end of the session. So please don't type anything in between. You can make notes and ask at the end of the session, please.
Yeah, thank you so much, Shweta, because I think this chat box becomes a little distracting. So, like Shweta said, we'll be happy to take all your questions at the end, and you can make a note of all the questions that you have, and we'll try to devote at least 5 to 10 minutes in the end of the session. And if you're not able to take it up, we'll definitely get back to you with written replies. So I hope that you all have been successfully pursuing this course. It has been 3 weeks now, and I hope you are actually getting the sense of why you have joined this course, and I hope it's making sense to you as well. Now we have reached module 4, so which is basically we're going to talk about HIV prevention strategies, but our focus is going to be pre-exposure and post-exposure prophylaxis. Now, I hope all of you have gone through the 2 videos which have been posted on Canvas. Now, as I told you in my first session, it is expected that you all at least go through the videos, because then this facilitating session, it becomes more of a revision for all of you, and we get more time to discuss things in our country's context. So there were 2 lectures this time posted. One was by Brian R. Wood, where he spoke about the pre-exposure prophylaxis for HIV. And there was one by Jehan Budak, where she spoke about the post-exposure prophylaxis and a new concept called treatment as prevention. Now, I sincerely hope you all have gone through this, because there is a lot of relevant content, lot of studies which were discussed, and the reading material was, I'm sure people have gone through the reading material and found it to be very, very helpful, because it helps in understanding what they have presented in their videos. Now, so to begin with, we are basically going to be discussing 2 aspects under pre-exposure prophylaxis. As you all know, this is something that does not exist in our NACO guidelines as of today, but pre-exposure is something that is already under discussion, and very soon we may find it included in our guidelines as well. Nobody knows, I mean, nobody can give us a timeline as to when it is going to happen, but definitely it is going to happen soon, because the discussions are already underway. So in PrEP, we are basically, PrEP is the short form for pre-exposure prophylaxis. So we are basically going to be discussing about who can get PrEP, what are the concerns and challenges that we are facing right now with PrEP, and what are the new things or the new formulations which are in pipeline, which may be the future for PrEP. When it comes to post-exposure prophylaxis, we are going to discuss our country's guidelines as to what we are going to do in our centers or our facilities with respect to post-exposure prophylaxis for HIV. And finally, we'll conclude with this new concept. I mean, it's most of you already know, but it's a relatively new term, which is called U is equal to U, which means undetectable is equal to untransmittable. So there is this new concept called treatment as prevention. So we'll be concluding the session today with that concept. So what is PrEP? Now, the initial half of PrEP, I've taken up slides from Brian Wood's lectures. So this is more so going to be a revision of what he has already told, but I'm trying to make it or simplify it more for all of us, because a lot of things on studies and the clinical trials, a lot of discussions have happened. So I'll try to simplify that for all of you, so that we can get a clear understanding of what is our ultimate take home message from this session. So as you all know, there is, I mean, the name itself says it all. Post exposure prophylaxis means we are going to give the prophylaxis after the exposure has happened. So you can see the red arrow here. The exposure has already happened, and for a limited number of time, which is usually 28 days, we give ARV prophylaxis so that the HIV transmission doesn't happen, which could have otherwise happened because of the single exposure. Pre-exposure prophylaxis, like we said, the prophylaxis, you can see the blue bar here, it starts before this red arrow. Before any exposure has happened, we start the patient on pre-exposure prophylaxis. This is something which will continue for a longer time. And the idea is you are protecting the person from HIV transmission, even when that person is exposed to repeated exposures. So this is the basic difference between post-exposure and pre-exposure prophylaxis. So what is PrEP? It is a prevention strategy in which a high-risk individual takes medication regularly along with continued behavioral risk reduction strategies. Now, what do we mean by these three terms? So please remember, PrEP is not a single solution to anything. PrEP is just a part of the entire strategy. So ultimately, we are talking about prevention strategy. We want to prevent HIV from happening. But that doesn't mean that if a person is on PrEP, 100% the HIV transmission is not going to happen to him or her. Why do we say this? Because our traditional methods of risk reduction strategies, which includes condom usage or safe other safe sex practices, safe needle usage. So all this has to continue even when PrEP is given. It doesn't mean that because I'm taking PrEP, I'm not going to take reduced risk by any other method. Again, we are talking about high risk individuals here. So PrEP is not something that is advocated for the entire population or for the general population. The idea of giving PrEP is to people who are at substantial risk of getting HIV. Here, mainly in this context, at least when they are talking about the US guidelines, or if you see the WHO documents, our key populations mainly involves men having sex with men, the transgender population. It could be a serodiscordant couple because there is one partner who's negative and the other partner is positive. So the negative partner has that substantial risk of contracting the transmission, and IDUs. So when we talk about these high risk individuals, that is where PrEP comes into play. It is not something that is advocated for the general population where the risk of getting HIV is low. So this is an underlying thing that we need to understand about PrEP. Now, as you all know, the FDA in US approved a drug called Truvada in 2012. Truvada is nothing but a combination of emtricitabine and TDF. What is TDF? It is tenofovir disoproxil fumarate, and the combination of this runs with the brand name Truvada. Now, as early or as late as October 3rd, 2019, the same FDA US approved a second drug for PrEP, which is called Descovy by its brand. And this brand, it consists of emtricitabine and a different component of tenofovir, which is tenofovir alafenamide. Now we will, in the future slides, we will see what is the major difference between both these drug components and why is it that this new drug came to be approved for PrEP. Now let me reiterate again, we do not have this currently in our NACO guidelines, but we can expect it anytime in the future because talks are already on the way. Now we come to this, we come to this table where it talks about multiple studies. Now we don't need to remember what study happened where or the percentages or whatever. What is the key message that we need to take from here? The first study that they're talking about, that is IPREX, or you can take any study for that matter. Now this study was done amongst around 2,500 population of MSM and transgender, where majority were MSM and a minor population was transgender women. Now, what did they do? They had two arms in their study. One population which was given the daily TDF FTC. Now, for the sake of convenience, let me talk like this rather than using the full name. So this is the Truvada that we had earlier seen. It is emtricitabine with tenofovir disoproxil fumarate. So one arm was given this PrEP and the other arm was just given a placebo. And what is the effect that was seen? The population which was taking the PrEP had a 44% reduced incidence of HIV. Now the same thing holds good for other studies. Let us take the second one, which was a partners PrEP study. It was done in Africa. around 4,800 serodiscordant heterosexual couples were studied. Now they were given three combinations, or they had three study arms. So one was just given plain tenofovir, the other they had given TDF and FTC combination, and then the third was a placebo. Again, they got significant reduction where PrEP ARVs were given. There was a significant reduction in HIV incidence. Now, most of the studies talk about, or it shows us, it again and again, it is proving to us as to how PrEP has played an important role in reducing HIV incidence. But also, please note, whenever you look at the study population, these studies have always been done using a population which was at a high risk of contracting HIV. So be it MSM, or they are serodiscordant couples, or IDUs, or transgender women, that is where the study was conducted, and that is where the impact was seen. Now, if you note these last two studies, which was basically done in heterosexual women, and both of them were done in Africa and in other countries like Zimbabwe, etc. Now, unfortunately, in both these studies, we didn't find the impact that we were looking for like in the other studies. So they came with a conclusion that in this population, the TDF-FTC gave no protection. Now, we cannot generalize anything from this, because anybody who wants to learn more about these studies, your Canvas already offers you a lot of readings, and most of these trials are all available online, where you can go through details of what was given and what was the result and what was the interpretation. Now, in short, what happened was in these two studies, when they analyzed as to why this showed no protection, they came to know that the adherence levels of taking this PrEP medication amongst this women population was very, very low. As low as, so when they actually took samples to check the drug content in the blood levels, it was less than 40%. So which means the adherence was very poor. So obviously we cannot conclude that PrEP did not work here, because PrEP was not even taken properly as advised. And indirectly, why was PrEP not taken? That boiled down to another new issue of stigma. Not a new issue, it's an old issue, but something where the women actually were scared of even keeping those PrEP bottles at home, because they were scared that people would question as to why you are having it. And that was the reason that adherence was low, and that was the reason that these studies did not come up with good results. So let us go with the positive takeaway. That is that in the high risk population, if PrEP is actually taken as advised or as the dosage is advised, there is definitely a significant reduction in HIV incidence. Now, again, importance of adherence. We are just reiterating, like I told you last time, in the last two studies, which was FemPrep and the VOICE study amongst women, you can see the adherence was as low as 15% and 20%. So obviously there was no HIV prevention efficacy which was seen in these two studies. But in the other studies, for example, let's just take one. If you see the partner spread study, so the dark shadowed place here shows you something, the HIV prevention percentage for the entire population. And this 90% is especially for adherent patients. So what does it mean? That if, again, like I said, if the population or the patients are taking PrEP and they are adherent to PrEP, the HIV reduction or the incidence reduction or HIV prevention percentage can go as high up to 90 or 92%. Now, another important thing that we need to take away from here is, please remember, we never say that PrEP will give you 100% protection. Why? Because even if the patient has been completely 100% adherent to PrEP, there have been very occasional cases, I am not sure of the number, but there have been some studies where the patient, in spite of being adherent to PrEP, has contracted HIV, but later on it was found that that person actually acquired a strain of HIV which was resistant to both the drugs which were given in PrEP. So there is a one-off possibility that this could happen. But like I said, overall, and what I'm talking about, maybe a single case or two, but when you see an overall study, PrEP offers at least 90 to 95%, 90 to 92% of HIV prevention efficacy if taken adherently. So now we come to this new thing, which is in October 2019, the FDA in the United States, they approved a second drug as a part of PrEP. So what is the second drug? Like I already said, it is tenofovir alafenamide, which is also known as TAF, versus TDF is what we are regularly using, the tenofovir disoproxil fumarate. Now, what is the difference? So tenofovir, all of us know, it is one of the most widely used medication for HIV and hepatitis B treatment. And it is also approved, at least in the US and in some other countries, for de-exposure prophylaxis. Now, two forms of the drug are available. One is the older version, which is TDF, and the newer one, which is TAF, or tenofovir alafenamide. Now, what is the difference? So TAF, or the newer version, it is a prodrug. So this is absorbed much more quickly than TDF, and as soon as it reaches the blood, it produces higher levels of the active drug more quickly. So what is this active form of tenofovir called? It is called tenofovir diphosphate, or TFV-DP. So what happens is, all these, whether you're giving TDF or whether you're giving TAF, ultimately in the blood, it has to provide this active drug called tenofovir diphosphate. Now the advantage is TAF does this more quickly rather than TDF. So what it means is, small doses of TAF is enough. So somewhere where your regular fixed dose of TDF contains 300 milligram of TDF, your TAF might only contain 25 milligram of TAF, which means that you are giving the drug in the smaller dose, but it is actually giving you higher levels of the active drug, which is going to fight your HIV. But because you're overall giving it in a smaller dose, it leads to lower drug levels in the blood, and therefore your kidneys, bones, and all other organs are less exposed. So what does this mean? It means that TAF, in spite of, it obviously it fights well with your HIV, even when given at lower doses. At the same time, the side effects which normally we face with TDF, especially on kidneys and bones, are significantly reduced. But the only one drawback, again, we need more studies to prove this, but it is that your TDF actually, it lowers cholesterol levels and it lessens the cardiovascular risk. But in TAF, that kind of beneficial effect is not seen, and TAF may be associated with more of weight gain. So like I said, this is the basic difference between TAF and TDF. Now, tenofovir alafenamide is already, in many countries, it has already been started as your ART treatment for HIV. What here we are talking about is only the PrEP. So in the next forthcoming session, I'm not sure if it is the next week or the week after that, where you have an exclusive session on ART medications, this TAF component will be discussed even more in detail. Now, why did we learn this difference? It was because there was this one study called DISCOVER. And this DISCOVER study is what led to the approval of the Descovy drug, or tenofovir alafenamide and emtricitabine combination, as a PrEP drug. So what did they do here? They mainly took your MSM population and transgender women, and it was a randomized controlled trial. It was a multinational trial, and there were two arms. So one arm actually received the older version, or Truvada, of the PrEP regimen, and one arm received the newer version of the regimen. Now, when the results were studied, this was the result. What does this show? That your newer combination of the Descovy drug, it showed only 7 infections per 4370 person years, whereas the older combination showed about 15 infections. What does this mean? So we cannot directly conclude, looking at this graph, that because 7 infections are here and 15 infections are here, hence Descovy is a better drug. No. So there are a lot of statistics associated with this. But the one thing that we can clearly say out of this study is, here you can see something called the incidence rate ratio. This is nothing but, if you divide 0.16 divided by 0.34, you're going to get this number, which is 0.47. And in the study, before they started the study, they had pre-specified one criteria for this incidence rate ratio, which was 1.62. Now, because after the study, we got an incidence ratio which was less than the pre-specified criteria, the only thing that we can conclude from this study is that the FDC-TAF combination is non-inferior to FDC-TDF combination. What does non-inferior mean? In very, very lay terms, it just means it is equally efficient or equally efficacious. So there is no confusion. We are not saying that this is better or that is better, but we are saying that both of them are equally efficient in controlling HIV incidence. Now, the other thing to note is in both the arms, they have said that one new infection which occurred, because you can see 7 infections have occurred here and 15 infections have occurred here. Out of these, one infection in each arm, it occurred even though the PrEP was taken adherently. That means there was adequate PrEP medication or adequate ARV levels in the blood, and in spite of that, the infection occurred. But this is the story only of one infection. What happened to the remaining? So the remaining infections in both arms have occurred only in those patients who have not been taken PrEP adherently, who have not taken PrEP adherently. So that is the major conclusion from this study. So finally, obviously, we came to know that in terms of HIV incidence, both your arms or both the medications were equally efficient. Then what made FDA approve the TAF drug? Another thing, now this table, I will not go into details. Only 2 things that I want to highlight here is, like we said, because TAF, the prodrug, it gets converted into the active drug very quickly in the blood, there is less exposure to the other organs. Hence, all your bone mineral density, if you see the figures, the TAF shows better results when it comes to your bone mineral density and your GFR. So in a way, we can say that both these drugs are equally efficient when it comes to controlling your HIV incidence or when it comes to preventing your HIV. But in terms of side effects, TAF has fewer side effects compared to TDF combination. So this was another one of the major reasons why FDA approved this drug also, which is Descovy. So the final conclusion was Descovy is non-inferior, which means Descovy is as good as Truvada. But again, let us emphasize that this was done in the high-risk MSM and in the transgender population. Both the drugs were very well tolerated, but when you check the bone and renal outcomes, they are in favor of the TAF combination. And in both the cases, there is no evidence of risk compensation. We'll be discussing risk compensation later, but just to brief you, what does risk compensation mean? It means we all have a feeling that if I'm giving PrEP to a person, what if that person becomes overconfident and starts indulging in more high risk behavior than he used to before? But all the studies have actually negated this thought or negated this fear from our mind, because wherever studies have been conducted, it is said that because you're giving PrEP, the person is actually more aware, he is more sensitized that he has to prevent the transmission of infection or prevent getting the infection. And in fact, their risk behavior actually decreases rather than, what we feared. So this is about the major conclusions that we got after the study. So finally, what did the USA do? I mean, in the States, they approved Descovy for adults and adolescents who weigh at least 35 kg or more, and they have a sexual risk of acquiring HIV, but excluding vaginal sex. Again, this is important. So we have the study, Discover study has been done amongst MSM and transgender population, and there the common route of acquiring the infection was the anal sex route. So it was not vaginal sex. So we do not have any other study where this is confirmed, and hence FDC-TAF cannot be generally prescribed if the risk is due to vaginal sex. And again, when it comes to dosing, there is something called on-demand dosing. So, and there is something called daily dosing. So as of now, your FDC-TAF is approved only for a daily dosing, which means the person has to take the tablet every day. What does on-demand dosing mean? So there are, like Truvada, there was a study conducted where they said that it's normally called the 2-1-1 dosing. What does that mean? So before the high risk sexual event, you have to take 2 tablets of the PrEP 2 to 24 hours before the sex happens. And the third tablet you will take 24 hours after you've taken the first 2 tablets. And the fourth tablet you will take 48 hours after the first dose. So which means 2-1-1, and that's called on-demand dosing. Now, on-demand dosing has only been studied for the Truvada component. It has not been studied for Descovy. Hence, we cannot prescribe that. So they only go for the daily regimen. Now that we have discussed what and when and where to whom you can prescribe Descovy, what are the concerns? Now, it is quite surprising that this FDA approval has come just from one RCT or one randomized control trial. Normally, FDA requires more evidence. Now, nobody knows the reason why as to this one study has significantly resulted in this approval. Nobody knows. So we just go by what is already approved. And again, mainly here we have involved primarily young and otherwise healthy individuals to take PrEP. So what is actually the problem? Now, basically we are saying that TAF will have less impact on the kidney than TDF, which means we will like to use TAF for people who already have renal insufficiency. Our common sense will say that if there is a person who has renal insufficiency, if there is an alternative to TDF, and if that alternative is TF, why not we give him TAF? But in this study, all the patients who were enrolled in this study, they were people who already had a creatinine clearance of more than 60. That was an inclusion criteria. So therefore, we do not have adequate results on renal insufficiency and using of TAF. So that is one of the concern again about Descovy. And like we have already discussed, the vaginal sex risk factor is not considered absolutely here. And there is also the concern about weight gain and lipid abnormalities as side effects for TAF. So these are the concerns associated with the Descovy medicine. So far after the update, because this has been approved only in October, the CDC guidelines still does not, Descovy is not included as PrEP in the CDC guidelines so far. And like I have already told you about this on-demand dosing, your Descovy can be given only as daily dosing and not as this 2-1-1 dosing. So what are the recent trends in PrEP use and how do we choose the candidates? Now, like everywhere, the problem exists in the US as well, that overall, obviously, they are saying that their HIV diagnosis is going down and they are giving a lot of credit for PrEP because they are saying that because of PrEP, the HIV incidence is coming down. But again, they have also found out that PrEP is largely underutilized even in their population. And there is a lot of access issue. So if you can see that there is a lot of disparity which exists between race, ethnicity, your age, gender, your geography. So there are some places with more access to PrEP. There are some populations which cannot access PrEP. So this is one of the major challenge that they are also facing towards utilization of PrEP. Now, another major barrier is the providers themselves have not heard of it. So if they just conducted a random survey of all your physicians or practitioners or clinicians, and they came to know that around 35% of this population, they have not even heard of what PrEP is. And amongst people who have heard it, even they have reported that adherence to PrEP is a major issue. Now, all of us know that even when an HIV person is infected, putting him on ART and getting him adherent on ART itself is a big challenge. So just imagine when there is another person who is absolutely hale and healthy, there is no symptoms, but if we want to put him on this PrEP regimen and expect him to be adherent, then it is going to be all the more a challenge. So it is not as easy as it sounds, be it prescribing PrEP or for the patient to be adherent to PrEP. Now, there is also concerns at the level of the patient. Why? Because the patient is concerned about side effects, the patient is concerned about cost, and obviously the patient doesn't know, even in the US, the patient doesn't know where exactly he or she can get PrEP from. So there are challenges, a lot of challenges like these in order to access PrEP, and these have to be overcome if really it has to bring a dramatic change in the population. So there were two guidelines on PrEP which were released, one in 2014 by CDC and the next one was in 2018. And like I said, the TEF approval has happened only in 2019. So these guidelines are yet to be revised after that. So if you are interested now, whom are we going to, what is the eligibility criteria? Now here, this slide, it only gives you some examples. If you want the exhaustive criteria of who can be given PrEP, I request you all to please go through the reading which is given for this module. There is there is an exclusive reading on pre-exposure prophylaxis. There is an exclusive reading on post-exposure prophylaxis. And in PrEP, you will get population wise as to who all are eligible amongst MSM, who are eligible amongst TG, among IDU. You will get an exhaustive list. But overall, what we want to again re-emphasize here is PrEP can be given only to those people who have a high risk of acquiring HIV. So these will include somebody, like I said, who's in a discordant couple. Now, again, here, basically the concern should be that the HIV positive partner, if he or she has high viral load, then it is all the more imperative for the other partner to take PrEP. Now, again, MSM who are not using condoms 100% and who are not in a monogamous relationship, obviously they are at very high risk. Now, any of these high risk population who have had bacterial STIs in the last 6 months, they are also at risk. Persons who inject drugs. And again, one new concept is recurrent need for post-exposure. So suppose there is a patient who has already taken PEP or post-exposure prophylaxis many times. So we would rather convince him to go for PrEP because we know that that person is not ready to change his behavior and is going to be exposed at multiple times. So we can consider shifting him from post-exposure to pre-exposure prophylaxis. And like I said, transgender population. So this is not an exhaustive list. These are just examples of people who can be considered for PrEP. So what do we do? Now we cannot randomly just give PrEP to anybody who fits into these criteria. There is an eligibility for that. So the first eligibility obviously is that they should fall under the high risk category. Now this person, he or she should be able to take a pill every day because again, this is a once daily regimen. So the pill has to be taken every day. Now screening of HIV has to be done before determining eligibility and also hepatitis B. Now we'll discuss a little on hepatitis B also. Why? Because if you, now we are using two drugs. For example, you can take, tenofovir and emtricitabine. These are also drugs which can be used to treat hepatitis B. So before starting PrEP, suppose the person had an underlying hepatitis B infection, which we didn't catch or which we didn't diagnose, and we start the person on PrEP. So what will happen is, as long as the person is on PrEP, indirectly his hepatitis B is also getting treated. But for some reason, suppose the person becomes HIV positive later, or suppose his risk behavior reduces. So at that time, if you're going to stop giving PrEP, this hepatitis B, which was under check, will suddenly flare up now. So it is important to determine the hepatitis B status also of the patient. And accordingly, if you have to stop PrEP in this patient, you have to ensure that the treatment for hepatitis B continues beyond that. Now, one thing that I missed saying earlier, when we are here at eligibility, I'm going to say one more thing is, PrEP is not given lifelong. So please remember, we always determine the eligibility depending on the risk status. So a person who has high risk status today may be at lower risk 3 months down the line or 6 months down the line. It could be because of their behavior change. It could be because they are not exposed to whatever they were exposed before. So at that time, every time, that is why when they say here, they normally give PrEP only for 90 days at a time, because you have to review the patient every 3 months. And if that high risk status of the patient changes, we should also consider stopping PrEP for that patient. So please remember, it doesn't mean, it is not like lifelong ART where you start PrEP, the patient takes it lifelong. He or she has to be continuously reassessed during every visit to determine if the PrEP needs to be continued or not. So counseling is very, very important. Like I said, you cannot just give PrEP and say, okay, you've taken this medication, you are not going to be infected with HIV. It is very, very important for them to use all other preventive measures, all other traditional preventive measures that they would otherwise use, because PrEP is not a standalone strategy. It is a package and it has to be treated as one component of that package. Lab monitoring, definitely you have to do it, because you have to keep finding out if the person, because there are chances, one-off chances, like I told you earlier, that in spite of taking PrEP, the patient may turn out to be HIV or may contract HIV. Now, what they have to do is, if the patient turns out to be HIV positive, obviously you have to stop PrEP, because as you know, PrEP contains only 2 antiretroviral drugs. But our ART regimen guidelines say we have to give at least 3 antiretroviral drugs as treatment, as ART. So this transition of treatment has to happen immediately, and hence it is very, very important for these PrEP patients to be monitored at regular intervals. So again, like I said, we do not have a clear-cut timeline. Like nobody can ask or nobody can answer that if I have taken PrEP today, let us take an example. For example, there is a serodiscordant couple and they are trying to conceive. So we are giving the negative partner PrEP. So if he or she comes and asks us, okay, I'm taking PrEP today, when is the right time to have, a condomless sex so that we can try to conceive? There is no fixed answer to this. But one general guideline that we have is this. What does it say? It says that now we have already seen that this tenofovir diphosphate is the active form of the drug. So after you've given PrEP, this is the older version, after you've given Truvada, what happens is the maximum concentration of this active component, it reaches your rectal tissue in 7 days, your vaginal tissues in 20 days, and blood in 20 days. So this is for the maximum level. So which means, what is the level just for HIV protection? We don't know, but it will definitely be less than this number. So which means that if it is going to take 20 days for it to reach the maximum intracellular concentration, at some concentration in between itself, my HIV prevention protection has already started. So that is why we say, so we can see over here, that is why the guidelines say that there has to be a 1 week lead-in time. So we are at least waiting for a week for the PrEP to act, so that we know that the medication has gone inside, it is converted to its active form, and now it is fit to fight against HIV. And so the 2 different guidelines, they talk about different things for stopping PrEP. So CDC says that ideally it is better to stop it 28 days after your last sexual exposure. And the IAS guidelines say it is 1 week after your last sexual exposure. Now, generally, I mean, by common sense, it makes more sense to continue it for 28 days at least, because that's how we give PEP also. But then these are just 2 different guidelines. So is it safe? Now, what are the concerns? We've talked so much about PrEP. So this is something I'm going to be moving quickly with. So like in any other treatment, there is going to be a startup syndrome. There will be patients who will come with minor symptoms like minor side effects like nausea, headache, or fatigue. Now, in terms of renal safety and bone effects, we don't need to be really worried, because whatever studies we have found or whatever in the trials, there is not a very, very high clinically significant difference in renal safety and bone effects when you're using the TDF-FTC combination. So there has been no cases where because of this, you have had to stop PrEP or something serious has happened to the patient. So this is something that you really don't need to worry about too much. And what about drug resistance? Because you're giving PrEP, because you're giving these 2 drugs, can the patient already develop HIV drug resistance? This is again a major fear. But again, we can be rest assured. Why? Because there have been large trials which have been conducted, and where they have shown that the incidence of HIV resistance is very, very low. It is not significant. And when it comes to our newer formulation of Descovy, studies have still not happened. So we have to wait and watch as to how this is going to affect emergence of drug resistance. But is there something that we can do if we are scared about this? So what is it that can be done? The first thing is prescribe no more than 90 days of medication at a time. Like I already said, we have to keep reassessing the patient who is on PrEP. So at every 3 months, if you're going to keep testing him for HIV and we pick up the infection quickly, there is a good chance that we can immediately switch that patient to ART and drug resistance will not develop. So our major aim lies in continuously, proactively assessing the patient. And if so, an infection occurs, we catch it as early as possible and shift him or her to treatment. And what about sexual risk taking? Like I already said, this is something that we already discussed, that it doesn't mean that because people are taking PrEP, their high risk behavior will increase. In fact, studies have shown the opposite. So you can see over here in the IPREC study, the graph is going down. So what does that mean? It means that your unsafe sex, or maybe the condomless act of sex, is actually going down over a period of time for people who are taking PrEP. Now, the common sense here is, like I said, PrEP is not a one shot strategy. So every time the patient is on PrEP, we are going to call him back to our facility. We are going to counsel them every time. We are going to test them every time. They'll be screened for STIs. So every time, the more and more we are doing this, the more and more we are creating an awareness in the patient. And that patient actually becomes more responsible in terms of reducing his or her high risk behavior. And that is what has come out of the trials which have been conducted. So we don't need to worry about this. Otherwise, fear. Obviously, there are 1 or 2 studies which show the other way around, but the majority of the trials show that the high risk behavior, in fact, decreases after taking PrEP. So obviously, there are many benefits because of PrEP. These are self-explanatory. I'll not spend time on this. So what is the future? Now, there are a lot of questions which need to be answered. We do not, have answers to these questions as yet. Like I said, what is the role of intermittent dosing? The 2-1-1 dosing I talked about, more studies have to be conducted. How soon after a person starts PrEP is it protective? Like I said, we only have a vague number. So we say give a 1 week lead time, but we don't know exactly when the protection starts. Another, for a serodiscordant couple, if my positive partner is already having undetectable viral load, then why should the negative partner take PrEP? Is there any benefit? We don't know. Again, what is the best use for FTC-TA for PrEP, and what are the long-term benefits? Now, like I said, Discover was a very recent study. So we still don't have long-term impact results of this new combination of Descovy. Is same-day PrEP safe and feasible? We don't know. When will the long-acting injectable? Now, these are formulations which are still under development. They are under trials. So until we really have a clear answer to this, we will not be able to go ahead with, obviously we know PrEP is effective, but how much, that quantification, that will require more data and more studies. So in future, we already have the PrEP pill. Now there is a lot of research going on the other formulations, which includes gel, the vaginal film. So there is one vaginal ring, which has the dapivirine content. It's another NNRTI. And this is something that can be used monthly, but obviously each of these formulations comes with its own adverse, concerns as well. So we do not, and an injectable. So injectable, there is a research going on a drug called cabotegravir, which is an integrase inhibitor. And we believe that there can be an IM PrEP component where you just need to take an IM injection maybe once in 2 or 3 months. But again, like I said, all this is something which we can expect in the future. So right now, we can only do with prevention strategies which we already have. So this is one of the trials. Again, you can get the details of this trial on this website itself, which is HIV Prevention Trials Network. It is called the HPTN 083. So here mainly it is comparing the effectiveness of, like I told you, the new intramuscular injection of cabotegravir with your daily oral TDF and FTC combination. Now this trial is already underway. We do not have the results, so we will have to wait and watch as to what happens with the future of it. So yeah, so as I told you, this prep is just one part, which doesn't mean because we are giving this, we can give away with any of the other prevention strategies that we already have. So with this, we finished the prep part of it. Now we move on to the post-exposure prophylaxis for HIV. Now here, prep is something we didn't have in our guidelines. Post-exposure is something we have in our guidelines. So what we are going to look at now is exactly what our guidelines will tell us. It is not very different from what has been told in the lecture by Budak. Obviously, the regimens are different. The regimen that they give in the US is different from what we follow in India. But more or less, principally, what PEP is for and the basic principles of PEP remains the same. So what is PEP? Now it refers to the comprehensive management. Again, it is not something that you just give a pill and send the patient home. So here our main aim is we want to minimize the risk of infection after there has been an exposure to bloodborne pathogens. So this is not only about HIV, we also know that the most common bloodborne pathogen that we can get through these infections is also HBV and HCV. So who is a healthcare provider? Any person who's working in a healthcare setting who can be exposed to infectious material, as simple as that. So we cannot, say that, okay, healthcare professionals, it means only the doctors and the nurses or only who's handling the patient directly. No. Even your class 4 workers, obviously, they are also at the threat of having a needle prick if we do not dispose the needles properly. So anybody working in the healthcare setting, anybody who's at risk of getting exposed to any infectious material is called a healthcare provider. But PEP need not be restricted only to healthcare provider. There can be many others, like for example, like I told you, sanitary workers, so workers who are involved in needle exchange programs, many of the private settings. So there could be these people also who are exposed to infectious material. So why PEP? Now, in my earlier lecture where we had discussed diagnosis of HIV, there was this diagram where we saw as to how the virus actually gets into the dendritic cell and how it spreads to your CD4 and then it becomes generalized. So that is one thing that I would like to quickly remind all of you. So what happens is when your mucous membrane gets exposed to anything that is, to HIV, what happens? The first replication, we all know it happens at the dendritic cells. These are the cells which are present in the skin or the mucosa. From there, where do they go to? They go to your lymph system. And from the lymph system, immediately it becomes a systemic infection. Now, this time period that we have over here between this exposure and between it spreading everywhere, that is the window of opportunity for post-exposure prophylaxis. So our aim is we give this post-exposure as soon as the exposure has happened and we prevent this cycle of HIV from occurring. That is our major aim. So what are the various definitions? Obviously, there can be an occupational exposure or a non-occupational exposure. So what does occupational exposure mean? If I'm exposed to any of these infections, bloodborne infections, during my job, when I'm performing my duty, it becomes an occupational exposure. So any healthcare professional is at risk of a bloodborne infection. And this is contact of blood, tissue, or any other infectious body fluid. It does not only mean contact with blood. It can be any infectious body fluid. And how can this exposure happen? So how can this occupational exposure happen? The first is the most common, like we all already know, it's a percutaneous injury, which is a needle stick or a cut with a sharp instrument. Second is when there is contact with mucous membrane. Suppose there is something that goes into your eye, some fluid, or your mouth, that is mucous membrane. Contact with non-intact skin. So it contacts your skin and your skin is already, suppose you have dermatitis or it is chapped or it is already abraded. And in that abraded skin, there is some contact with an infectious fluid. And finally, there is contact with intact skin when the duration of contact is prolonged with blood or other potentially infectious body fluids. So this was occupational exposure. What is non-occupational exposure? It is basically the same exposure which happens outside of the workplace setting. So what is the example? Anything. For example, the condom breakage or sexual assault. These cases are non-occupational exposures. Now, what is the risk of exposure from different body fluids? Now, this is something that most of you already know, but just to emphasize, which are the fluids which are considered at risk? It is blood, semen, vaginal secretions, and all other fluids which covers various parts of your organs, which is cerebrospinal fluid, synovial fluid, pleural fluid, peritoneal, pericardial fluid, amniotic fluid, and other body fluids contaminated with visible blood. So all these are considered to be at risk. Now, which of the body fluids are not at risk fluids? So these include tears, sweat, urine, feces, saliva, sputum, and vomitus. But please remember, they are not at risk only when they don't contain visible blood. As soon as there is visible blood in any of these secretions, be it the at-risk column or the not at-risk column, they are immediately considered at risk. So if there is visible blood, everything is at risk. But when there is no visible blood, it is these which are not that much at, we don't have too much risk of contracting HIV from these fluids. So this is something that we have already discussed. The only thing we need to emphasize in our earlier lecture. So what we are interested here is to see this needle stick exposure. So there is a 0.3% chance of contracting HIV if there is a needle stick exposure. And if there is an exposure to the mucous membrane, like I said, something goes into the eye or your nose or your mouth, the risk is 0.09%. Now, the same comparative needle stick injury risk, these two 0.3 and 0.09 was for HIV. If it is for HPV, it ranges from 9 to 30%, and for HCV, it is 1 to 1.8%. So we need to be careful about the other bloodborne pathogens as well, not only HIV. So when does the risk increase? So it's just common sense. Obviously, if the quantity of blood during the exposure is large, there is more risk of contracting HIV. If the device that you are affected with, if that is visibly contaminated with blood, there is more danger. Now, any procedure which involves placing a needle in the patient's vein or artery, and then that needle comes and sticks you, obviously you are at more risk. Larger bore needle, a deeper injury, and obviously when the exposure is to a terminal HIV patient or an AIDS patient, the risk of us getting HIV through this kind of exposure is more. So this is just a summary of assessing the risk of exposure. Like we said, hepatitis B, it ranges, it may go up to 30 to 37%. Hepatitis C is 1 to 3%, whereas HIV is 0.3%. Again, in the kind of exposure, the maximum risk that we have is with the percutaneous injury. Cutaneous and mucous membrane is much less. And higher risk is obviously when the injury is more deep, when your device is bloody, and when the device is already used in the artery or the vein. So what do you do? Now, obviously, it is a state of panic. I think all of us have gone through being in the healthcare setting. We have all, I'm sure all of us must have gone through this phase at least once in our life, either as a, your MBBS, your graduate or your postgraduate days or your internship days. This was very, very common. So obviously it's a medical emergency, but please try to remain calm. This is not a state of panic, because whenever we start panicking in these situations, we obviously tend to do something wrong. So we need to be calm. The first thing is, whenever, okay, you have a pricked finger, the reflex is you immediately put it into your mouth. That should not be done. What should first be done is just wash the place with, your skin with soap and water. Now, the ideal recommendation is your post-exposure prophylaxis should be started within 2 hours of the exposure. It can go on up to 72 hours, but beyond 72 hours, there is actually, the trials say that there is not much effect. We'll be talking more about this soon. So what is the steps in management? Suppose we know an exposure has happened. We have to follow these 6 steps. First is you have to give some first aid to the exposed site. Second step is you will find out if the person is eligible for PEP or not. Third is you counsel for PEP. Fourth is you assess the need and you have to prescribe the medication. Fifth is there has to be laboratory evaluation, and sixth is follow-up. So these are the major steps that you are going to follow when the exposed person comes to you. So we'll first talk about step 1, which is the first aid. What is the first aid that you're going to do? So like I said, if it is an exposure that has happened to the skin with a needle stick or a sharp instrument, you have to wash the hand or wash the wound with soap and water. The place should not be scrubbed. You should not milk the wounded site. All this will lead to more abrasion, more friction, and more injury in the site. So please do not do anything that is, use of friction or rubbing or scrubbing or anything on the wound site should not be done. Do not use any antiseptics like, your alcohol, betadine, chlorine, nothing. And like I already said, do not put the cut finger in your mouth. Now, these are very basics, but it is important to reiterate all of this because, that's one of the major components of post-exposure prophylaxis. So for the eye, what do you do? Obviously, if your eye is exposed, you're going to wash it. Please wash it only with water or normal saline. Obviously, you're not going to use soap. You have to sit in a chair, tilt your head back, and ask, somebody around to put water or normal saline. Suppose you have contact lenses, you're wearing contact lenses. Please do not remove it immediately. Let them stay in there. In fact, the contact lens may act as a barrier and it will protect you rather than you removing it and causing more friction. So let it remain, and only after the eye is cleaned, you can remove it. And for the mouth, again, you're just going to repeatedly rinse it, use water or normal saline, and keep rinsing your mouth and spit it. Do not use any soap or disinfectant. So this was step 1, where it was first aid. Now, what is step 2? Eligibility for PEP. How do you determine if the patient is eligible for PEP or not? Now, earlier in our NACO guidelines, you were aware there was something called as source code. There was something called as exposure code. Then we had to find out which code matches where and then decide whether PEP has to be given or not. Now, NACO is done with all that. So it is a very simple, basic guideline. We are just following what WHO is saying. So we need to know the HIV status of the source. And the second thing we need to know is the type and severity of the exposure. So where will you give PEP? In what kind of exposures will you give PEP? Whenever it involves exposure to body fluids like blood or anything that is blood stained, for example, blood stained saliva, breast milk, genital secretions, and other fluids like we've already discussed, cerebrospinal, amniotic, peritoneal, synovial, pericardial, pleural fluid. They warrant PEP. Secondly, mucous membrane exposure. So splashes to the eye, nose, oral cavity, sexual exposure, they warrant PEP. And what is parenteral exposure? Just as we discussed, if there is an accident with a high-bore needle or there is a deep wound, or a painful wound, a hemorrhagic wound, then you will give PEP, or an accident with a material which has already been used in the vein or artery of the source. So if these kind of exposures happen, you have to give PEP to the patient. So which are the ones which do not require PEP? So obviously when the exposed individual is already HIV positive, you will not give post-exposure prophylaxis. When you have determined that the source patient is HIV negative, you do not give PEP to the exposed person. And if there is exposure to body fluid which are not at risk, like I've already said, obviously they should not be blood stained. So if it is tears, saliva, urine and sweat which is not blood stained, then you don't need to give PEP to the exposed person. So there is this general comment also by WHO which says, in settings with generalized HIV epidemic and those among key affected population with high infection burden, it is reasonable to assume that all sources of unknown HIV status pose a risk of infection. Now, what does this mean? So it is not always possible to get to know the source of the HIV HIV status of the source. So what do we do? So obviously our first aim is to try to get to know the status. If we do not get to know the status, we at least try to get other information. Suppose that patient is from a high risk category or from a key population group. Then we assume that, okay, there may be a larger risk and we give PEP. It also depends generally on the prevalence of HIV in that group of population. So this may vary from place to place. It may vary from person to person. For example, the Northeast may have completely different scenario of somebody with an IDU. They may have more, percentage population with IDUs. That may not happen somewhere else in our country. So this is totally, it depends on the decision of the clinician who is sitting there and who has assessed the exposed patient. So, and please remember, so just because you're waiting for the HIV test result for somebody, you will not postpone PEP. Like I said, PEP is a very time-bound intervention. If we are not going to give PEP during that time, there is no point giving it later. So we cannot sit and wait till the source result comes out. But obviously there is a clause where WHO also says that suppose you have started PEP in a patient and later on, maybe after 3 or 4 days, you come to know that the source was negative, you can stop PEP in the patient that you have advised. So again, counseling for PEP, very, very important. Like I said, it is very traumatic. We have all been through this phase where there has been a prick. This could have happened during blood collection. It happened to me when I was an intern. So it is a very, very scary thing. Till the time you come to know that, okay, the source was HIV negative, you are getting nightmares saying that maybe I'm already HIV infected. I don't know what is going to happen and things like that. So it is very important, first of all, to counsel the patient when you are giving PEP. It is not something which is mandatory. They should understand, the client should understand why you're giving them PEP, and they should also be emphasized that safe sexual practices have to be followed at least till the first HIV negative result comes out. And please remember that they need a lot of psychological support because they are already very anxious. And plus, you all know that when you start your PEP medications, there is just terrible nausea. You're going to have terrible side effects, and that may actually result in stopping PEP. I am very sure most of us at some point of time have stopped PEP halfway through because we have not been able to continue it for 28 days. So it is very important. This counseling step cannot be avoided in PEP. So after counseling, yes, now we come to the regimens. Now, this is the most latest document of WHO. All the readings the readings given in this module already has it, but I've just put a snapshot in front of you. So this is the latest guideline which came out in December 2018. So what PEP regimen does WHO recommend? In adults, tenofovir plus lamivudine or tenofovir plus emtricitabine. This should be the backbone of the regimen. And what should be the third drug? So now WHO recommends dolutegravir, and the other recommended regimens are atazanavir, ritonavir, darunavir, ritonavir, lopinavir, ritonavir, and raltegravir. So this is for adults. For children, zidovudine, lamivudine is the preferred backbone. But as alternative regimens, you can also use abacavir, lamivudine, or tenofovir, lamivudine. So again, the third drug here recommended is DTG. And when that is not available, if that cannot be given, you can always give atazanavir, ritonavir, again, lopinavir, ritonavir, and raltegravir. This is the recommendation by WHO. Now, what are we following? So in our NACO guidelines, what we have is, we have taken the same backbone for adults. Tenofovir, lamivudine, 1 tablet has to be given once daily. And lopinavir, ritonavir, 2 tablets have to be given twice daily. So what is the recommendation? Within 2 hours of exposure is the best time to give it. So the first OD dose of your tenofovir, lamivudine should be given within 2 hours of exposure. At the same time, you'll give 2 tablets of lopinavir, ritonavir. Now, every day after that, tenofovir, lamivudine will be continued in the OD dose, and lopinavir, ritonavir, you'll take 2 tablets twice a day. Now, for how long will you be taking this for? 28 days. Now, if lopinavir, ritonavir is not available, we can use PLE regimen also, where 1 tablet OD will be given at bedtime for 4 weeks. That is the alternate regimen. Now, as you all know, there are latest guidelines coming up with dolutegravir coming into our program, but obviously the fixed dose combinations are going to take a while to roll out. So until the OM comes and until you have stocks of these FDCs, this cannot be enrolled. But this is what you can expect in the near future. The upcoming guideline is going to be 1 tablet once daily of tenofovir, lamivudine, and dolutegravir, and that will be continued for 4 weeks. Now, when it comes, so this was the regimen which is different, which is shown in the video by Budak. So there they have actually taken the Truvada, which is tenofovir and emtricitabine combination, and they combine it either with raltegravir or with dolutegravir. But they again do it, their criteria remains the same. It has to be given within 72 hours of the exposure, and it is given for 28 days. Now for children, what do we give? So for children, our backbone that we use is zidovudin, lamivudin. But if hemoglobin is less than 9%, we will use abacavir instead of zidovudin. Now the third drug option, again, lopinavir, ritonavir, is preferred if the child is less than 6 years and weight is less than 20 kgs. But if the child is more than 6 years and weight is more than 20 kg, we can give dolutegravir as the preferred third drug. So timing, all of us know, we have already said it has to begin within 2 hours of the exposure, and you have to act immediately. So there is no scope of wasting time when it is a question of occupational exposure. And there are studies which show that there is very little benefit if PEP is taken after 72 hours have passed. So there are many animal studies. Obviously, we cannot do these kind of studies in humans. So there are many animal studies which indicates that whenever you are initiating post-exposure prophylaxis, it is obviously more efficacious when you are initiating it early compared to 72 hours following exposure. And it has to be continued for a period of 4 weeks. So this graph shows us the same thing, that as the time goes, your benefits of PEP is going to come down and the risk of PEP will continue to remain the same. So at this point of time or beyond this point of time, there is no point of giving PEP to the patient. Now we are back to step 5, which is the baseline laboratory investigation. Like we already discussed, we are not only talking about HIV here, we are also talking about preventing HPV and HCV. So it is important to get that testing done. There has to be a complete blood count, and because we are giving tenofovir, it is good to do a serum creat as an investigation. And so when it comes to HPV, yeah, the testing should be done as early as possible. And HIV tests should also be offered, because if the patient turns out to be HIV positive, when you are considering PEP, you have to not consider PEP and put the patient on ART. So, and obviously when to test for HIV, appropriate consent has to be taken from the patient. And please remember that the patient is also at risk of getting infected with hepatitis. So yes, when you give PEP, doesn't mean you just give the pill and send the patient home and say, okay, come back after 28 days. No, we have to routinely monitor them. We have to monitor them 3 to 6 weeks after exposure also. And if there are any symptoms which develop, the patient has to be referred to the ART center. During this period, the patient should be counseled to avoid blood donation. And if the patient is breastfeeding, that should be stopped too. And obviously, the positive prevention measures should continue, because we don't know the HIV status of this patient, and hence, therefore, adequate precautions have to be taken. And it is very important to do adherence counseling, because there is no use of taking PEP just for a matter of 4 to 5 days and then stopping it. So it has to be adherent, the patient has to be adherent, and it is very important to counsel them about the adverse drug events as well. So what are we going to do between weeks 2 and 4? We call them again. Do a complete blood count. We can do urine protein and serum creat. And please remember, at 6 weeks, 12 weeks, and 24 weeks, we have to repeatedly keep doing the HIV testing in order to make sure that the transmission has not happened. So obviously, we have to address the concerns of HPV and HCV as well. Now, when do we need an expert opinion for PEP? So there are a lot of instances where we may not be able to take the decision at our end. So what happens? Suppose the exposure has happened and 72 hours have passed. Will we absolutely not give PEP, or will we have to reconsider the case? We will have to reconsider the case, because we have to find out what kind of exposure it is, how big was the threat, how big was the risk. And yes, then experts will opine on whether PEP needs to be given even beyond 72 hours or not. again, because again, if the source is unknown, we don't know the HIV source, like I said earlier, we may or may not have the prevalence data in that subgroup of population. We don't know how risky the source patient was. So hence PEP will be advised on a case-to-case basis. Again, if there is a known or suspected pregnancy, if there are breastfeeding issues, please, expert opinion has to be consulted. Again, one important point is if the source patient is already on ART. So for example, the source patient, for example, is already on second line ART. So if the patient itself is on second line ART, we cannot give, post-exposure prophylaxis with first line drugs. So ideally, if we know that a patient is already, the source patient is already on a second line ART, the PEP for the exposed person will actually be the ART regimen that the source person is taking now. So what does that mean? Suppose a patient is, taking a second line regimen now, it means that he is already resistant to first line. So the strain in his body, the HIV strain in his body is already going to be resistant. So our PEP first line is not going to help the exposed patient. So this has to be consulted with experts, and finally a decision has to be taken on what PEP regimen needs to be given. So whenever in doubt or whenever cases are complicated, please refer to experts. And yes, now, so this was about the occupational exposure. In non-occupational exposure, what we cater to in ART centers especially is when the exposure happens after a sexual assault. In the guidelines, we still do not, I mean, this is there in the guidelines, but we do not have any other guidelines just for, when sexual exposure happens because of condom breakage, or if there is any other non-occupational exposure. So right now the guidelines include only the sexual assault part. So again, like we have already emphasized, do not wait for the source patient's HIV test results to come for PEP initiation. It has to be initiated first. And whenever it is, the risk is from a source patient who is already taking ART, experts have to be consulted in order to decide which PEP regimen needs to be given. So with this, we come to an end with the post-exposure prophylaxis. But this post-exposure prophylaxis is only the second best approach to occupational and non-occupational exposure. What is the best approach? The best approach is always prevention. So we are all in health facilities, more so with the COVID pandemic situation already happening. It is very, very important for all of us to abide strictly by universal precautions. So primary prevention has to happen. All of us know, whether it be hand hygiene or whether it be use of your personal protective equipment. And we have always number of times this has been mentioned that needles should not be recapped. So as responsible healthcare professionals, it is important for us to guide the people around us. If they do not know, please let them know. Please teach them the correct practices. It could be your nurses, your lab technicians, or anybody. So it is very important for us to abide strictly by these measures. These are just some, pictures highlighting what I'm already saying. So, and please remember, there is no point of putting on a glove or putting on a PPE after you know that the person is HIV positive. So when any lay person comes to you, you cannot predict whether the person is positive or not. And that is the time you have to take precaution. At that time, if you don't take, there the risk happens. So universal precautions is something, and that's literally why it is called universal. It has to be practiced at all times across all population groups. You cannot selectively follow universal precautions for some people and selectively follow it for the other. Please remember, universal precautions is for you. It is not for the others. It is to protect us. It is to protect ourselves. So if we are not going to follow this, there is no point. So with this, we come to the last bit of our topic today, which is treatment as prevention. Now, in simple statements, what does treatment as prevention mean? It just means that you want to treat somebody who is HIV positive. so that that person does not transmit HIV infection to somebody else. So this is, we are using HIV treatment, or we are using ART as a prevention strategy. Now this is something that we are already doing. It has just been, colorfully draped in words, and it has been given a nice name and a nice strategy name, saying treatment as prevention. But our aim is, and that is why we come to, this is where Treat All actually helps, because now we've reached a stage where we are treating all HIV patients with ART. So our aim is, we treat them, and we treat them so well that they actually are virally suppressed, and because they are virally suppressed, they are not going to cause new infection amongst others. So this is what is treatment as prevention. Now, how did we come to this, concept? So like we said, there had, all of you who have been in the program for many, many years know how the program has transformed. So there was a time when there was a CD4 criteria. Only then, if it was beyond 500, less than 500, then less than 350, then less than 250, that is how ART would start. But then there came a time where it was decided that anybody who is HIV positive, irrespective of your WHO staging, irrespective of your CD4 count, you're going to start. How did this happen? The landmark trial that we are going to talk about here is the HPTN 052 trial. Again, if you want more details, it is directly available on the HPTN website. Anybody who's interested can feel free. It makes a very interesting read. So there were about 1763 different couples. The study was held across 9 countries. And all the persons, they had a CD4 count. Amongst the positive members, all of them had a CD4 count between 350 to 550 as CD4. So here in this trial, what did they compare? They didn't compare whether to give ART or not. They compared when to give it. Either you immediately give ART or you defer ART. So in one arm, they gave ART immediately to all these positive patients. And at the time, immediately means at the time of enrollment, they were given ART. For the other patients, set of patients, they waited till the CD4 decreased to 250 and then they started giving ART. So what was the result? The result was obvious, that in the group of patients that where ART was started at the time of enrollment, the reduced rates, the sexual transmission to the uninfected partner reduced by 96%. So which means 96% cases, they did not have any transmission which happened from the positive to the negative partner when the treatment was started early. This was in comparison with when the treatment was started late. So this was a landmark trial. So the same thing is mentioned here. Now another highlight over here that you can see is something called linked transmission. So like I said, they have said 93 to 96% risk reduction happened, which means in most of the cases, like I told you, the HIV didn't happen at all to the seronegative partner. And even when it happened, they found out that it didn't happen from the seropositive partner who was enrolled in the study. It happened because this new infection patient had some sexual exposure encounter with some other XYZ partner, not with the partner enrolled in the trial. So this was also found out using their genetic analysis. So that is what they mean by zero linked transmission, which means even if HIV transmission happened amongst this study group, it was not directly linked to the HIV positive individuals in the study group. It was beyond the study group. If there was, suppose, there was some other person and the negative, this seronegative partner had an sexual encounter and then got it from the other person, not from anybody enrolled in the study, which gave a clear-cut evidence that if ART is initiated timely and if the patient is adherent and if there is viral suppression, there are rarely chances that it will get transmitted to your seronegative partner. So that is where a lot of partner studies were done. Like you can see, partner 1 study, partner 2 study, the opposites attract study. Most of them, they always use serodifferent couples. And look at the highlight here. What is the CLS, which is condomless sex acts? So in the partner 1 study, they studied 880 different couples. And during this study period, 58,000 times condom-less sex happened. And in spite of that, the risk reduction was 95% with zero linked transmission. So this shows how efficient your ART treatment can be in preventing HIV transmission. So this is a major idea of treatment as prevention. So with this, we come to this major message of U is equal to U. What does it mean? Undetectable is equal to untransmittable. So it refers to a concept that an individual with an undetectable HIV viral load is incapable of transmitting their HIV infection to their sexual partners. So when we get a viral, so this is what we need to aim at. We have so many people on treatment with us. The next question is, are they virally suppressed? Because that is when the HIV epidemic can be controlled. So if your viral load report says not detected, or TND or target not detected, or virally suppressed by our definition is less than 1000, when they are virally suppressed, that is when we can say that undetectable is equal to untransmittable. And please let me tell you, these studies, like I said, this is applicable even when they have condomless sex. So that doesn't mean we are going to advocate condomless sex, but what I mean to say is that is the efficiency of the treatment that we are providing. So this is a very easy message, it is a very catchy message, and something that will impact the lives of our patients. And there have been a lot of examples where, even this thought, if I'm going to put it into my patient's mind, that if you take your pill properly, your wife who's been negative will remain negative throughout. I think that is one of a major motivation that you can give to your patient to be adherent to his or her treatment. So this is something that we can really use in our facilities. So with this, we come to some, the final 1 or 2 slides where we are just going to highlight some key points. So PrEP, we already know there are 2 regimens that we discussed. One is TDF-FTC and one is TAF-FTC. There has to be a regular risk assessment which is done for PrEP patients. It can't be lifelong, it can't be forever. It is very important to monitor these patients, because if they turn out to be HIV positive, they have to be shifted to ART treatment. Then adherence is very, very important in PrEP. If patients are not going to be adherent, PrEP is not going to be efficient. And there is very, very low risk of HIV drug resistance developing. So we don't need to worry about that. And like I said, it's very important before giving PrEP to identify if the patient has chronic hepatitis B infection or not. Because if we are going to stop PrEP, this patient may lead up with a hepatitis B flare. When it comes to post-exposure, it definitely works, but timing is very, very important. The earlier, the better. It has to be continued for 28 days. And you have to be tested for HIV at 6, 12, and 24 weeks. Then obviously, wherever you are working, there has to be implementation of universal precautions. And it is encouraged that all healthcare workers please undergo complete hepatitis B vaccination. It is a blessing that we have a vaccine for this disease, and it is best that we get vaccinated rather than sitting and preventing it later. And finally, the major concept of undetectable is equal to untransmittable. So prevention is primary. This is the key. With this, I conclude my session. Now, if you have questions, you can please bring it up now. Shweta, I'm unable to see the box, I think.
Yeah, ma'am, I'll check that on the canvas and get back to her.
Yeah, I don't know what I'm opening actually.
There's one question in the chat box.
Yeah, or if you can,
Yeah, I'll read. What is the percentage of positivity after PEP?
So this is something I need to go through the studies. Whoever has asked the question, Shweta, if you can please make a note, because I'm not aware of the numbers. So we will definitely get back to you with exact studies on this. Okay, now I think
Any
I
more
can see.
questions? Participants can unmute themselves.
I can see some more. Yeah, hello.
Yeah, I had a question I posted on chat also. I know it's a little fun, but they said PEP is to be given to anybody who's having exposure to HIV infection in the course of their occupation, doing their work. So will we consider sex worker also like being exposed as occupational hazard, or will it be?
I don't think so, ma'am, because now we have a separate group for them. We are considering them as key population. So they fall under a high risk group already in our program. And what we majorly mean by occupational is when it comes under the healthcare facility. So we are more so concerned about PEP when it comes to healthcare professionals working within their healthcare facilities and then getting exposed to these infectious body fluids. So as of now, yeah, like you said, obviously there are other countries which are implementing it, but right now in our guidelines, we do not have this sanction for using PEP for FSWs.
But can we give them PEP if, like, otherwise they're using condom? There is an incident where the condom breaks or something like that happens.
Again, ma'am, like I said, it's not a part of the guideline. So because, NACO doesn't advise that if the exposure is happening because of condom breakage, then give PEP. That is not something that we have, but I think very soon that is going to come up because again, they are looking to revise the PEP and PrEP guidelines. So we are hoping that those will also be included. But I can see one more, that there is some research going on in about PrEP. Is it at your side?
Yeah, it's one, the Shan Foundation, it's MSM site.
Okay.
ICMR through NARI is doing this research at two sites. One is a clinic site. They are both on, I think, MSM. One is a clinic site at Pune and the other one is at Jalandhar.
Oh, that's very nice. So
For
maybe
MSM
we'll look forward to you if we get any updates.
do their own study. I attended the training also at NARI. Pune.
Oh, very good. So definitely,
Yeah.
I think you
Dr.
should
Priya,
keep us
another
posted.
Another thing I wanted to know, what I have come to know in the course of my working in the National AIDS Control Program, we in Punjab are giving TLE as PEP to the healthcare workers, or we had one incident where, they had done laparoscopic tubectomies and later on when they didn't test the people who were undergoing tubectomy. So one of the persons turned out to be HIV, like on screening HIV reactive. Though later on that patient also turned out to be negative, but we didn't want to take a chance. So we gave that post-exposure prophylaxis to all the patients who had undergone surgery that day for 1 month. And luckily, on a follow-up after 3 months, none of them was seropositive.
Oh, which is a good thing. But like I told you, ma'am, even in our guidelines, our first choice of regimen is still TL lopinavir ritonavir. But whenever lopinavir ritonavir is not available, we still advocate giving TLE. So it is completely okay to give TLE also for those 28 days. That is the alternative regimen for us even in NACO.
That's what we did.
Yeah, that's good.
It was more like a firefighting measure.
Yeah, correct.
Yeah.
So I think there are a few more here. If a terminally ill patient is on first line for say 4 months with very low CD4 and viral load is not known, and a healthcare worker has to be given PEP, giving TL lopinavir ritonavir may not be enough if he is in failure and we don't know yet. Yeah, you're obviously right, and that is the reason we always say that whenever, see, in this case, I mean, you're also saying they are terminally ill. Ideally, the patient with our rigid system should have at least come into, taking the second line or third line if the patient had reached that stage and if the patient was within our system. So our point is, when you know that the patient is already on some different regimen, it is imperative for us to know what the regimen the patient is on. Otherwise, like you said, we may give PEP with our usual first line regimen and it may not even work. So that is what we need to find out, that what regimen is actually suiting, what is the regimen that the source patient is actually responding to, because without that, then your PEP may or may not be as efficient as we claim it to be. waiting for the OM. Yes, again, like I said, we are all waiting for the final OM. So once that is, and that is going to be out pretty soon, I presume. But in spite of that, we will also need to get our dolutegravir stock. So without that, we'll not be able to start. And as soon as the OM is out, yes, the revised PEP guidelines will come up again. So if a person is already on PEP, unfortunately, if he or she has had a needle stick injury, does the individual, again, it depends on, you'll have to go back to whatever assessment that I talked to you about, that what happened with the second needle stick injury. Again, was it from an HIV positive patient? What regimen was that patient on? Because then accordingly, the regimen may have to be changed. So those questions have to be answered before you can take a call on whether PEP needs to be extended or not. But definitely PEP may have to be extended. I'm not saying another 28 days, but if it happens, if it is a question of repeated exposure, it may have to be extended. Can we give guarantee of PEP to the exposed? Again, like I said, there are no numbers. We do not have, we will not say 100%, again, it depends a lot on the adherence of the patient also. So we know, and by clinical experience, we know that a lot of people fail to take PEP after say 7 to 8 days. So it is very, very important for us to at least convince them that this is the best chance that you have and you should be adherent to the treatment. What will be PrEP schedule for a serodiscordant couple? Again, like I said, this is something in the PrEP, in our guidelines as of today, we do not have PrEP treatment at all. So this is not, so as of today, what we can do is when there is a serodiscordant couple, our first focus should be make the HIV positive partner virally suppressed. If that person is virally suppressed, like I told you, even if there is going to be a condomless act, the chance of transmitting the infection to the partner is negligible. And that is what we want. And the second thing that you can advise, I mean, obviously, there are things that people do right now for conception, which includes, sperm washing is done, intrauterine insemination can be done. IVF obviously is the higher end, so there are cost issues. But before that, these are things which can already be, which can be suggested to the patient. But again, if you're actually talking about PrEP in other countries, if you're not talking about the Indian settings, we just give them, the only thing we can tell them is at least wait for a week after you're taking PrEP. Like I told you in my slides, there is no clear-cut timeline that after so many days PrEP will become effective. That is a question mark. That is still, we are waiting for studies to happen on that. So we do not have that timeline. But in our scenario, our major aim should be get the positive partner to be virally suppressed. I think so. Yeah, so the percentage positivity, I will get back to that with the numbers, because I'll have to refer to what are the studies on that. There is some issue on Canvas, I think. Shweta, if you can take it up.
Yeah, the one that ma'am had asked about, Dr. Manpreet. I'll get back on that, ma'am.
Yeah.
Manpreet, ma'am, I'll get back on that. There's one more question. What's the guideline of PrEP for re-exposure?
That's exactly, I think, what I discussed just now, that if there is a re-exposure, you have to reassess the situation overall again, find out what the regimen, the new exposure happened with which source, what regimen was, if that patient was on ART, and that is when you can take it ahead. So I think we are done with the questions. If there's anything else, please put it up on your, through mail or WhatsApp, and we'll get back to you.
So, Dr. Priya?
Yes, ma'am.
If a patient, if a medical, healthcare provider is re-exposed to this thing, an infected patient again maybe has a needle stick again, so should we be doing the viral load of the second patient before extending the PEP?
That is a part even for the first one, ma'am. So like I said, it is very important to identify the source patient. You should know whether the patient has HIV or not. If the patient has HIV, what is the regimen he is on? And if the patient is again on HIV, what is the viral load of the patient? Everything will, that workup will have to be done before
so
we decide.
So we would have to prioritize that patient.
Yes,
for
yes.
Viral load.
Yes, yes.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, everyone, for participating in this webinar.
Thank you so much. And please, Shweta, I think you should update them about the homework, the dates. I forgot to note that down.
Yeah, it is coming Monday. No, it will be now next Monday. 5th May, I suppose.
4th May, I guess.
That's 4th May.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's 4th May. By noon, you should finish your assignments.
Yeah. So please, all of you, keep track of your time, and I hope you all are don't have issues with your quizzes and your assignments. If there is any help that you all require, please get back to us. And by Monday 12 noon, please finish off your quizzes and submit them. Thank you so much, everyone.
Yeah, thank
Stay
you, ma'am.
safe. Thank you.